The stagecoach door opened, and Josephine Campbell stepped down into the dusty street of Madisonville, Texas, her gloved hands trembling as she clutched a worn carpet bag that contained everything she owned in the world. It was late September 1878, and the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small town that would become her new home, though the man waiting for her had no idea what secrets lay beneath the high-necked dress and long sleeves she wore despite the oppressive heat. She had answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride 3 months ago, desperate to escape the life that had marked her body and nearly broken her spirit. And now here she stood, 22 years old, and terrified that the cowboy who had paid for her passage would take one look at what she really was and send her right back to Boston. Thomas Zimmerman stood outside the general store, his hat pulled low against the glare, watching the stagecoach with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness that made him feel like a boy rather than a man of 26 who had been working cattle since he could walk. He had placed that advertisement 6 months ago after his mother passed, leaving him alone on the ranch his father had built before dying in a cattle drive when Thomas was just 15. The ranch hands were good men, but the house felt emptier every day, and he had begun to wonder what the point of building something was if there was nobody to share it with. When Josephine's letter arrived, carefully written in a neat hand that spoke of education and grace, he had read it a dozen times before responding, hardly daring to hope that a woman from back east would truly want to make a life out here in the rough country of Texas. Josephine's eyes scanned the handful of people on the street until they landed on a tall man with broad shoulders and sun-weathered skin, wearing dusty work clothes and boots that had seen better days. Something in the way he stood, respectful but uncertain, told her this was Thomas Zimmerman. She forced her feet to move forward, each step feeling like it might be her last as a woman with any chance at a normal life. When she reached him, she looked up into hazel eyes that held more kindness than she had seen in years, and for a moment she almost believed this might work. "Miss Campbell." His voice was deeper than she expected, roughened by years of shouting over wind and cattle, but gentle in a way that made her throat tighten. "Yes, Mr. Zimmerman, I presume?" She kept her voice steady, a skill she had learned through necessity. "Just Thomas, madam. Nobody around here stands on formality much." He reached for her bag, and she let him take it, noticing the calluses on his hands and the strength in his movements. "The wagon is just over here. I figured we could stop by the preacher's house on the way to the ranch if you are still willing. I know we agreed in the letters, but I want you to know you can change your mind. I will pay for a room at the boarding house if you need time to think on it." The offer surprised her. Most men would have insisted on the marriage immediately, if only to ensure their investment did not walk away. "That is very kind, but I have made my decision. I knew what I was agreeing to when I got on that train in Boston." What she did not say was that she had nowhere else to go, no family to return to, no prospects that did not involve the kind of work that had put most of the scars on her skin in the first place. She had been honest in her letters about being an orphan, about working in a textile mill, but she had not mentioned the fire that had destroyed the building 2 years ago, or what had happened to her in the aftermath, when she had been forced to take work in a household that turned out to be a nightmare dressed in respectability. Thomas nodded and helped her into the wagon, his touch careful and brief, as if he was afraid of frightening her. As they rode through town toward the small white church at the edge of the settlement, Josephine tried to imagine what her life would be like now. She had read Thomas's letters so many times she had them memorized. He had written about the ranch, about the work of raising cattle and horses, about the land that stretched for miles under an endless sky. He had not written flowery words of romance or made promises he could not keep. Instead, he had been honest about the hardship of the life, the loneliness of it, and his hope that they might build something together based on mutual respect and partnership. The preacher, a thin man named Reverend Hollies with kind eyes and a shock of white hair, seemed unsurprised by their arrival. He called his wife to serve as a witness, and within 30 minutes, Josephine Campbell became Josephine Zimmerman in a ceremony so brief and simple it felt surreal. Thomas slid a plain gold band onto her finger, his hand steady even though she could feel the slight tremor in her own. When the Reverend pronounced them married and told Thomas he could kiss his bride, Thomas hesitated, his eyes searching hers for permission. She nodded slightly, and he pressed a chaste kiss to her forehead, so gentle it made her want to weep. The ride to the ranch took nearly an hour, and Thomas filled the silence by pointing out landmarks and talking about the property. "The house is not fancy," he said, "but it is solid. My father built it to last. There are 3 bedrooms upstairs and a parlor and kitchen downstairs. I have been keeping the place as clean as I can, but I will admit housekeeping is not my strongest skill." "I am sure it will be fine," Josephine said, though her stomach churned with anxiety. Eventually, he would expect her to be a proper wife, and then he would see the truth written across her skin in raised welts and burn marks, and the thin white lines of scars that crisscrossed her back and shoulders. The thought of his disgust, of the way his kind eyes would fill with revulsion or worse, pity, made her want to jump from the wagon and run until her legs gave out. The ranch appeared as they crested a small rise, and despite her fear, Josephine felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. The house was larger than she expected, 2 stories of weathered wood with a wide porch that wrapped around the front. Beyond it stood a barn and several outbuildings, and in the distance she could see cattle grazing in fenced pastures. It was not Boston, but it had a stark beauty that called to something deep inside her, something that had been crushed but not quite destroyed. Thomas helped her down from the wagon and carried her bag inside. The interior was dim and cool after the heat of the day, and Josephine looked around at the simple furniture and the small touches that spoke of a woman's presence from years past. Curtains hung at the windows, faded but clean, and a braided rug covered part of the wooden floor. Everything was neat, as if Thomas had spent considerable time preparing for her arrival. "I will show you to your room," Thomas said, picking up her bag again. "I have been sleeping in my old room, the one I had when my parents were alive. The main bedroom is yours." Josephine followed him up the narrow stairs, surprised again by his consideration. "I assumed we would share a room," she said quietly, her heart pounding. Thomas set her bag down at the end of a bed covered in a wedding ring quilt. "We are married in the eyes of the law and God," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "but I figure we are strangers in all the ways that matter. I want you to feel safe here, Josephine. We can take our time getting to know each other. There is no rush for anything else." The kindness in his words nearly undid her. She had expected many things from this arrangement, but genuine respect had not been high on the list. "Thank you," she managed to say past the lump in her throat. "I will be downstairs if you need anything. Take your time settling in. Supper will be ready in about an hour." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Alone in the room, Josephine sank onto the bed and let herself shake. She had made it this far. She was married to a man who seemed decent, and she had a roof over her head and the promise of safety. Now all she had to do was figure out how to keep him from discovering what lay beneath her clothes, at least until enough time had passed that he might not send her away. She unpacked her meager belongings, hanging the few dresses she owned in the wardrobe and placing her brush, and the single book she had managed to keep through all her moves on the small table beside the bed. When she went downstairs, she found Thomas in the kitchen, working at the stove. The smell of cooking meat and beans filled the air, and her stomach reminded her that she had not eaten since early morning. "Can I help?" she asked. "You can set the table if you like. Plates are in that cupboard." He gestured with a wooden spoon. They worked in companionable silence, and when they sat down to eat, Thomas bowed his head briefly before picking up his fork. The food was simple but well prepared, and Josephine ate more than she intended to, her body desperate for sustenance after weeks of travel and irregular meals. "Tell me about Boston," Thomas said, clearly trying to make conversation. "I have never been further east than Louisiana." Josephine chose her words carefully. "It is crowded and loud, and the buildings block out the sky. I worked in a mill for several years after my parents died. The work was hard and the pay was poor, but it was honest work." That much was true, even if it was not the whole truth. "After the mill closed, I took a position in a private home, but it did not work out." The understatement of her life, but she could not bring herself to say more. Thomas nodded, seeming to sense there was more to the story but too polite to push. "Well, I hope you will find life here more to your liking. It is not an easy life, but it is honest, and the land has a way of getting into your blood. I could not imagine living anywhere else." Over the next few days, they fell into a rhythm. Thomas rose before dawn to work with the cattle and horses, and Josephine threw herself into managing the house. She cleaned every corner, washed curtains that had not been touched in years, and began cooking proper meals that made Thomas's eyes widen with appreciation. She was careful to always wear long sleeves and high necklines, even though the heat sometimes made her dizzy. Thomas never commented on her clothing choices, though she sometimes caught him watching her with a puzzled expression. At night, she lay in the large bed alone, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch and trying not to think about the future. Thomas had been nothing but kind and respectful, keeping his distance and treating her more like a business partner than a wife. She should have been grateful, and she was, but a small part of her that she tried to ignore wondered what it would be like to be truly wanted, to have a husband who looked at her the way she sometimes caught Thomas looking when he thought she was not paying attention. 2 weeks after her arrival, the weather turned cooler, and Josephine felt like she could breathe more easily. She began exploring the property, walking through the pastures and learning the rhythms of ranch life. Thomas employed 3 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse, and they treated her with respectful courtesy, tipping their hats and calling her Mrs. Zimmerman in a way that still felt strange. One evening, Thomas came in from work later than usual, and Josephine noticed him favoring his left arm. "Are you hurt?" she asked, setting down the pot she had been scrubbing. "Just a scratch. One of the horses got spooked and I got in the way of a fence post." He tried to shrug it off, but she could see blood seeping through his shirt sleeve. "Sit down. Let me look at it." She moved toward him before she could think better of it, her instinct to help overriding her usual caution. Thomas sat at the kitchen table and began unbuttoning his shirt. The gash on his upper arm was deeper than he had implied, still bleeding sluggishly. Josephine fetched clean water and cloth, her hands steady as she cleaned the wound. She had done this before, in another life, tending to injuries that ranged from minor to severe. Her fingers worked efficiently, and she was so focused on the task that she did not notice Thomas watching her face with an intensity that had nothing to do with pain. "You have done this before," he said quietly. "Everyone has tended a wound at some point," she deflected, wrapping a clean bandage around his arm. "Not like this. You have medical training." She shook her head. "Nothing formal, I just learned by necessity." She finished tying off the bandage and stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they had been, close enough that she could smell the sweat and dust on him, mixed with something that was uniquely his scent. Thomas stood, rolling his shoulder to test the bandage. "Thank you. That feels much better." He reached out as if to touch her arm, then stopped himself. "Josephine, I want you to know that you can tell me anything. I know we do not know each other well yet, but I hope that will change. I hope you will come to trust me." The words hung between them, full of unspoken questions. Josephine wanted to trust him, wanted it so badly it was a physical ache, but fear held her tongue. "I should finish cleaning up," she said instead, turning away before he could see the tears threatening to spill. That night she lay awake for hours, Thomas's words echoing in her mind. He was a good man, better than she had any right to expect, and she was lying to him every day by hiding the truth of what she was. The scars on her body were not the worst of it. They were just the visible proof of everything she had survived, everything that had been done to her. How could she explain that the supposedly respectable household where she had worked had been a front for something much darker? That the master of the house had enjoyed inflicting pain? That she had endured months of abuse before finally escaping one night when he had drunk himself into a stupor? 3 weeks became 4, and then 5. October brought cooler weather and the work of preparing for winter. Josephine learned to preserve vegetables, to make soap, to do the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch house running. Thomas taught her to ride, putting her on a gentle mare named Daisy and walking beside her until she found her balance. His patience seemed infinite, and she found herself looking forward to the evenings when they would sit on the porch together, talking about their days or sometimes just enjoying the silence. But the weight of her secret grew heavier. She could see Thomas holding himself back, see the question in his eyes every time he looked at her. They were married, but they were not truly husband and wife, and it was her fault. He deserved better than a woman too broken to let anyone close. The breaking point came on a cold evening in late October. Josephine had spent the day doing laundry, heating water over the fire and scrubbing clothes until her hands were raw. As she carried the heavy basket of wet clothing up the stairs, her foot caught on the top step. She fell forward, crying out as her knee cracked against the wooden floor and the basket tumbled, scattering damp clothes everywhere. Thomas must have heard her fall because he was there within seconds, taking the stairs 2 at a time. "Are you hurt?" He reached for her, his hands on her shoulders, and she winced as his fingers pressed against a particularly bad scar through the fabric of her dress. "I am fine," she said quickly, trying to pull away, but he had felt her flinch. "You are hurt. Let me help you up." He supported her weight as she stood, then noticed her torn stocking and the blood seeping from her scraped knee. "You are bleeding. Come to your room and let me get the medical supplies." "No, really, it is nothing," but he was already guiding her to the bedroom, his arm around her waist. He sat her on the bed and went to fetch water and bandages. When he returned, he knelt in front of her, reaching for the hem of her skirt to examine her knee. Josephine jerked back instinctively, her breath coming fast. Thomas froze, his eyes meeting hers. "Josephine, what is wrong?" "I am just trying to help." "I know, I am sorry, She could not finish the sentence. "Are you afraid of me?" His voice was quiet, but she could hear the hurt in it. "No, no, it is not that." "Then what is it? For weeks now you have pulled away every time I get close. You wear long sleeves even when it is hot enough to fry an egg on a rock. You look at me sometimes like you expect me to strike you. What happened to you?" The question hung in the air, and Josephine realized she had reached the end of her ability to hide. The truth was going to come out one way or another, and she would rather tell him herself than have him discover it by accident. "I need to show you something," she whispered. "But you have to promise me something first. Anything. Promise me you will hear the whole story before you decide what to do. Promise me you will let me explain." Thomas's expression softened and he reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement before taking her hand. "I promise, whatever it is, we will face it together." She stood on shaking legs and turned her back to him. "Can you unbutton my dress? I cannot reach all the buttons myself." She felt him hesitate, then his fingers were working at the small buttons that ran down her spine. His touch was careful and impersonal, but she could feel the tremor in his hands that suggested this intimacy affected him more than he was letting on. When he reached the last button, she slipped the dress off her shoulders and let it pool at her waist, standing in her chemise. Then, before she could lose her courage, she pulled the thin cotton over her head. She heard Thomas suck in a sharp breath, and she closed her eyes against the tears that threatened. Her back and shoulders were a roadmap of pain, crisscrossed with scars from a whip, pockmarked with circular burn marks from cigars, slashed with thin lines from a knife. The worst damage was on her back, but the scars extended down her arms and across her shoulders, a testament to months of systematic torture. The silence stretched so long that Josephine thought she might shatter from the tension. Then she felt Thomas move behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "Who did this to you?" His voice was rough, almost unrecognizable with rage. "A man in Boston. The man whose household I worked in after the mill closed." She pulled her chemise back on with shaking hands, unable to bear being so exposed any longer. He was wealthy and respected, a pillar of the community. But behind closed doors he was a monster. I was not the first, but I was the youngest, and something about that pleased him. For 8 months I endured. And then one night I waited until he was drunk and I ran. I had no money, no references, nothing. A woman at a shelter helped me, told me about mail-order bride agencies. It seemed like my only chance. She turned to face him, clutching the chemise to her chest, and what she saw in his face made her breath catch. There was rage there, yes, but not directed at her. And beneath the anger was something else, something that looked like anguish. "You survived," Thomas said, and his voice cracked on the last word. "You survived that, and you were brave enough to start over, to trust a stranger enough to come all the way out here." He reached up slowly, giving her time to move away, and cupped her face in his calloused hands. "Josephine, I am so sorry that happened to you. I am sorry you had to carry that alone, but I need you to understand something." He dropped his hands and took a step back, and for a moment she thought he was leaving, putting distance between himself and her damaged body. Instead, he began unbuttoning his own shirt. When he stripped it off, she saw that his torso was not unmarked either. A long scar ran across his ribs, white against his sun-darkened skin. Another puckered mark on his shoulder spoke of a bullet wound. Smaller scars marked his arms and hands, the inevitable result of years of hard physical labor. "My father died when a stampede trampled him," Thomas said quietly. "I was 15 and I watched it happen, could not do anything to stop it. That night, the cattle scattered and I went after them alone, stupid with grief. Rode right into a group of cattle rustlers. They shot me, left me for dead. I survived, obviously, but I spent 2 months recovering, and every time I looked at these scars, I remembered how helpless I had been." He moved closer, his eyes locked on hers. "My mother spent the last year of her life in terrible pain from a cancer that ate her from the inside. Toward the end, she made me promise I would find someone to share my life with, that I would not let grief and work be all I had. These scars on my body remind me of pain and loss, but they also remind me that I survived, that I kept going." He reached out again, this time letting his fingers trace along her shoulder where a particularly bad scar disappeared beneath her chemise. His touch was feather-light, reverent. "These scars mean you are a survivor, They mean you are strong enough to endure the unendurable and brave enough to keep reaching for something better. They are part of your story, part of what made you who you are." Tears were streaming down Josephine's face now, hot and unchecked. "How can you say that? How can you look at me and not see something broken and used?" Thomas's eyes blazed with an intensity that pinned her in place. "Because I am looking at my wife. I am looking at a woman brave enough to cross half a country to start fresh. I am looking at someone who runs my household better than it has been run in years, who learned to ride a horse in a few weeks, who tends my wounds without flinching, who makes this house feel like a home." He traced another scar, following its path down her arm. "These marks do not make you less. They make you more brave, more resilient, more beautiful." "Beautiful," the word came out as a broken whisper. "How can you call them beautiful? Because they are part of you and you are beautiful." He leaned forward and pressed his lips to the scar on her shoulder, the touch so gentle it sent shivers through her entire body. "Beautiful," he whispered against her skin. He kissed another scar on her upper arm. "Beautiful." His lips found the mark on her collarbone where a burn had left its signature. "Beautiful." Josephine's legs would not hold her, and she sank back onto the bed, overwhelmed by the tenderness in his touch, by the acceptance she had never thought to find. Thomas knelt in front of her, his hands resting lightly on her knees, his eyes searching her face. "I know we married as strangers," he said. "I know you agreed to this because you needed safety and security, and I am honored to give you those things. But somewhere along the way, I started falling in love with you. The way you hum while you work. The way you watch the sunset like it is the first one you have ever seen. The way you talk to the horses like they are people. I love you, Josephine, all of you, scars included." She reached out with trembling hands and cupped his face, feeling the rough stubble under her palms, the warmth of his skin. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "Afraid that if you knew the truth, you would send me away. Afraid that I was too damaged to ever be a proper wife. But I think," she had to stop and swallow past the emotion clogging her throat. "I think I have been falling in love with you too. Your kindness, your patience, the way you have given me space to heal without even knowing what I needed healing from." Thomas turned his head and kissed her palm, then rose to sit beside her on the bed. "We can take this as slow as you need," he said. "I mean what I said. There is no rush." But Josephine was tired of being afraid, tired of letting the past dictate her future. She leaned forward and kissed him, tentative at first, then with growing confidence as he responded. His arms came around her carefully, holding her but ready to let go if she pulled away. She did not pull away. Instead, she deepened the kiss, pouring years of loneliness and pain and desperate hope into the connection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I am sure." And she was. For the first time since the nightmare had begun back in Boston, she felt like she had come home. They made love slowly, carefully, with Thomas checking in at every step to make sure she was comfortable. When his hands traced over her scars, he kissed each one he found, murmuring words of praise and love until she believed them. He was gentle but not tentative, treating her like someone precious but not fragile. And for the first time in her life, Josephine understood what it meant to be cherished. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the big bed, the quilts pulled up against the chill. Thomas stroked her hair, and Josephine felt a peace settle over her that she had never experienced before. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For seeing me, all of me, for not turning away." He kissed her forehead. "I am your husband. It is my job to see you, to know you, to love you. Thank you for trusting me enough to let me in." They talked late into the night, sharing stories they had been too afraid to tell before. Thomas told her about the pressure he felt to keep the ranch running, about the loneliness that had sometimes threatened to swallow him whole. Josephine told him about her childhood before her parents died, about the dreams she had once had of becoming a teacher, dreams that had died in the harsh reality of trying to survive. "You could still teach," Thomas said thoughtfully. "The town needs a school teacher. The one we have now is talking about moving back east. You could apply for the position." The idea sent a thrill through her. "Do you really think they would consider me?" "Why would they not? You are educated, you are patient, and you care about people. I think you would be wonderful at it." Over the following weeks, their relationship transformed. They moved into the same bedroom, learning each other's rhythms and preferences. Josephine bloomed under Thomas's steady affection, growing more confident and relaxed. The nightmares that had plagued her began to fade, replaced by dreams of the future. In November, she applied for the teaching position and was hired to start after the new year. The school board had been impressed by her education and her thoughtful answers to their questions. Thomas had sat in the back of the room during her interview, his presence a quiet support, and the pride on his face when they offered her the job had made her feel like she could accomplish anything. The first snow came in December, blanketing the ranch in white. Josephine stood on the porch, wrapped in one of Thomas's coats, watching the flakes fall. Thomas came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How different my life is now compared to a year ago. How grateful I am that I found your advertisement, how much I love you." He turned her in his arms, his eyes soft. "I am the grateful one. You brought life back to this place. You brought life back to me." They spent Christmas quietly, just the two of them. Thomas had carved her a beautiful jewelry box from cedar, and she had knitted him a scarf and gloves from wool she had bought with money she had earned selling eggs in town. On Christmas Eve, they sat by the fire, and Thomas read aloud from the Bible while Josephine leaned against his shoulder, content in a way she had never imagined possible. In January, she started teaching, and she discovered she had a gift for it. The children ranged from 6 to 14, a mix of ranchers' kids and town children, and they responded to her patient encouragement and creative lessons. Thomas would pick her up in the wagon every afternoon, and she would spend the ride home telling him about her day, about the progress her students were making, about the funny things they said. Winter turned to spring, and the ranch burst into life. Calves were born, and Josephine learned to help with the deliveries, losing her squeamishness in the face of necessity. She and Thomas worked side by side, partners in every sense of the word. The ranch hands commented to each other that the boss seemed happier than they had ever seen him, and Mrs. Zimmerman's laughter had become a regular sound around the place. One evening in April, nearly 7 months after her arrival, Josephine realized she had not had her monthly courses in some time. She waited another week to be sure, then told Thomas over dinner. "I think I am with child," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas's fork clattered to his plate, and he stared at her, his face cycling through shock, joy, and concern in rapid succession. "Truly," she nodded. "I am fairly certain I have had all the signs." He was around the table in an instant, pulling her to her feet and into his arms. "This is wonderful. This is the best news." Then he held her at arm's length, his brow furrowed. "But are you all right? Do you need to see the doctor? Should you stop teaching?" She laughed, her heart full. "I am fine. Women have babies every day. I will see the doctor to be sure, but I feel healthy, and I can keep teaching for several more months yet." The doctor confirmed what she already knew, and he estimated the baby would arrive in November. Thomas became even more attentive, if such a thing was possible, fussing over her and trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work. She tolerated his hovering with amused patience, understanding that it came from love and the fear of losing what he had found. Her pregnancy progressed smoothly, and she taught through the end of the school term in May. Summer was hot, and she spent much of her time in the relative cool of the house, sewing baby clothes and preparing the smallest bedroom upstairs as a nursery. Thomas painted the room a soft yellow and built a cradle with his own hands, working on it in the evenings while she sat nearby, knitting tiny socks and hats. They talked about names, batting ideas back and forth. "If it is a boy, I would like to name him after my father," Thomas said one evening. Michael Zimmerman, but only if you agree." "I think that is a lovely name," Josephine said, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "And if it is a girl, what about Sarah after your mother?" The offer brought tears to her eyes. She had mentioned her parents only a few times, the grief still sharp even after so many years. "You remembered her name. I remember everything you tell me." He leaned over and kissed her belly. "Sarah or Michael, we will love them with everything we have." In November, when the air turned crisp and the leaves had fallen from the trees, Josephine went into labor on a sunny afternoon. Thomas rode into town at breakneck speed to fetch the doctor and the midwife, then paced the downstairs like a caged animal while the women attended his wife upstairs. The hours stretched into evening and he could hear Josephine's cries of pain, each one tearing at his heart. He wanted to be with her, but the midwife had firmly told him to stay out of the way. Finally, as the sun was setting, he heard a new sound, the thin wail of a newborn baby. He took the stairs 2 at a time and burst into the bedroom to find Josephine propped up on pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. The midwife was cleaning up and the doctor was packing his bag, both wearing satisfied smiles. "You have a son," Josephine said, her voice hoarse but filled with joy. Thomas approached slowly, almost afraid to believe it was real. He looked down at the impossibly small face peeking out from the blanket and felt something shift in his chest. "Michael," he whispered. "Hello, Michael." The baby's eyes were closed, his tiny fist pressed against his cheek. Thomas reached out a finger and Michael's hand wrapped around it with surprising strength. "He is perfect," Thomas said, looking at Josephine with wonder. "You are amazing. I cannot believe you just did that." She laughed weakly. "It is a good thing you cannot trade places with me for that particular experience. I do not think you would have fared well." After the doctor and midwife left with instructions and reassurances, Thomas carefully climbed into bed next to Josephine and they marveled over their son together. "He has your nose," Josephine said. "He has your chin," Thomas countered. "And I think he will have dark hair like yours." They stayed up most of the night, too excited and in love to sleep, watching Michael and talking in whispers about the future. Thomas thought about how far they had come, from 2 lonely strangers bound together by necessity to a family built on love and trust. Josephine thought about the scars on her back and shoulders, marks that she had once seen as evidence of her ruin, and how Thomas had taught her to see them as proof of her strength. The next morning, the ranch hands came by to congratulate them and get a glimpse of the newest member of the Zimmerman family. They were rough men, more comfortable with cattle than babies, but they looked at Michael with soft expressions and promised to teach him to ride as soon as he was old enough. Mrs. Henderson from town sent over a basket of food, and soon it seemed like half of Madisonville had found an excuse to stop by. Josephine recovered quickly, her strength returning with each day. She took to motherhood with the same determination she had brought to everything else, learning to nurse and soothe and interpret the different cries of her son. Thomas was a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor at night when Michael was fussy, singing old cowboy songs in his rough voice until the baby fell asleep. The winter passed in a blur of sleepless nights and precious moments. Michael grew rapidly, his face filling out and his eyes opening to reveal a hazel color that matched his father's. Josephine did not return to teaching, deciding she wanted to stay home with their son, at least while he was young. The school board understood and hired someone else, leaving the door open for her to return when she was ready. Spring arrived again, and with it came the work of running the ranch. Thomas had hired another hand to help with the increased workload, wanting to be sure he had time for his family. He would come in from the fields to find Josephine sitting on the porch with Michael, pointing out birds and horses and teaching him words even though he was far too young to understand. On a warm day in May, more than 2 years after Josephine had first stepped off that stagecoach, she and Thomas sat on the porch together, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Michael was asleep in her arms, his tiny hand fisted in the fabric of her dress. Thomas had his arm around her shoulders, his rough hand gently tracing the scar on her upper arm, visible now because she no longer feared the warmth and had rolled up her sleeves. "You ever think about what your life would be like if you had not answered my advertisement?" he asked. Josephine leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart. "Sometimes, but I cannot imagine it anymore. This is my life, the only one I want. You and Michael in this place. You saved me, Thomas." He kissed the top of her head. "We saved each other. I was existing, not living, before you came. You taught me what it means to have a home, not just a house. What it means to have family." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into night. Inside the house, the cradle Thomas had built waited for Michael to be put down for the night. Upstairs, the big bed they shared held the promise of holding each other through another night. In the barn, the horses Thomas raised and the cattle he tended represented the work that sustained them. And all around them, the land stretched out under the vast Texas sky, beautiful and harsh and full of possibility. Josephine thought about the girl she had been, broken and terrified, stepping off a stagecoach into an uncertain future. She thought about the scars that marked her body, each one representing pain she had survived. And she thought about Thomas, who had looked at those scars and called them beautiful, who had taught her that surviving was not enough, that she deserved to thrive. "I love you," she said, "not for the first time and not for the last." "I love you too," Thomas replied, his voice steady and sure. "Every single part of you always." Michael stirred in her arms, making the small sounds that meant he would wake soon and need to be fed. Josephine stood, and Thomas rose with her, holding the door open as she carried their son inside. Life on the ranch was not easy, and there would be challenges ahead, she knew. Hard winters and dry summers, the constant work of keeping the place running, the worry that came with raising children. But they would face it together, partners and lovers and best friends, building something that would last. Years passed, and the Zimmerman ranch prospered. Michael grew into a sturdy boy with his father's love of the land and his mother's quick mind. When he was 3, Josephine discovered she was pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, as Thomas had once suggested. Sarah had her mother's dark hair and a spirit that suggested she would be a force to be reckoned with. Josephine never did return to teaching in the town school, but she taught her own children with dedication, making sure they could read and write and cipher as well as any child in Texas. Thomas taught them to ride and rope and understand the land, skills they would need to inherit the ranch someday. When Michael was 7 and Sarah was 4, Josephine discovered she was pregnant a 3rd time. This pregnancy was harder than the others, and she spent much of it resting, frustrated by her body's limitations but understanding the need to be careful. Thomas hovered even more than he had with the previous pregnancies, taking over many of her usual tasks and enlisting the children to help with simple chores. In the spring of 1886, Josephine gave birth to twin boys, whom they named William and James. The birth was difficult, and for several frightening hours Thomas thought he might lose her, but she pulled through with the same strength she had shown in surviving everything else life had thrown at her. The twins were small but healthy, and with time they grew strong. The house that had once felt too large for Thomas alone now rang with the sounds of children. Michael helped his father with the ranch work, already showing promise as a cattleman. Sarah was fearless, climbing trees and racing her pony across the pastures, keeping her parents on their toes. The twins were still young, but they followed their older siblings everywhere, learning by watching. On a cool evening in October of 1887, 9 years after Josephine had first arrived in Madisonville, she stood in the yard and watched her family. Thomas was teaching Michael how to mend a fence, his patience evident in the way he explained each step. Sarah was showing the twins how to feed the chickens, her voice carrying across the yard as she made up a song about the birds. The sun was setting, turning everything gold, and Josephine felt a wave of gratitude so strong it nearly knocked her over. Thomas looked up and caught her watching. He said something to Michael, then walked over to where she stood. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "Everything, nothing, how blessed I am." She turned to face him, looking up into the face that had become dearer to her than her own. There were more lines around his eyes now, and threads of silver in his dark hair, but he was still the man who had kissed her scars and called them beautiful, who had shown her that love could be gentle and fierce at the same time. "I am the blessed one," he said, echoing words he had spoken years ago on another evening much like this one. "You took a chance on a lonely cowboy and made all of this possible." He gestured at the children, at the house, at the land they had built together. Josephine reached up and cupped his face, feeling the familiar roughness of his evening stubble. "We made it together. Every bit of it." He kissed her then, a kiss that held 9 years of love and partnership and the promise of many more to come. When they broke apart, Sarah was making exaggerated gagging sounds while Michael grinned and the twins looked confused, and they laughed, pulling apart but keeping their hands linked. That night, after the children were all in bed, Thomas and Josephine lay together in the darkness, talking quietly. "Do you ever regret not going back to teaching in town?" Thomas asked. "No. I loved teaching, but this is what I was meant to do, raising our children, building this life with you. This is my purpose." She traced patterns on his chest, following old scars that she knew as well as her own. "Do you ever regret sending for a mail-order bride instead of courting someone locally?" "Not for a single moment. Local girls knew me. They knew the ranch, knew what they would be getting. But you took a leap of faith into the unknown, and that took real courage. You were meant to be here, Josephine. You were meant to be mine, and I was meant to be yours." She snuggled closer, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Tell me again," she whispered. He knew what she was asking for, and he rolled slightly so he could trace the scars on her shoulder, the ones that were visible in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Beautiful," he murmured, kissing one scar. "So beautiful." He found another and kissed it too. "Every part of you. Every mark. Every inch. Beautiful." It had become a ritual between them, this reclaiming of her body and her history. What had been done to her in cruelty was transformed by his love into something sacred. The scars would never disappear, but they had lost their power to make her feel less than whole. More years passed, and the children continued to grow. Michael showed himself to be a natural rancher, with an eye for good cattle and a way with horses that made his father proud. When he was 18, he began courting a girl from town, the daughter of the feed store owner, and Thomas and Josephine watched with bittersweet pride as their eldest son began to build his own future. Sarah, true to her fierce spirit, announced at 15 that she wanted to be a veterinarian. It was an unusual ambition for a girl, but Josephine and Thomas had never been ones to hold their children back from their dreams. They arranged for her to apprentice with the local veterinarian, and Sarah threw herself into learning with the same determination her mother had once brought to surviving. The twins, William and James, were as different as night and day despite being identical in appearance. William was quiet and thoughtful, preferring books to cattle, while James was all energy and mischief, constantly finding new ways to get into trouble. Together they kept the household lively. In the summer of 1893, Michael married his sweetheart in a ceremony at the church in town. The whole town turned out for the celebration, and Thomas stood with his arm around Josephine, watching their son pledge his life to another person, seeing in them the same hope and promise that he and Josephine had once represented. "He is so young," Josephine whispered, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "He is older than I was when I lost my father," Thomas reminded her gently. "And he has something I did not have at that age. He has a family to support him, to help him figure out life. We will make sure he and his bride have what they need to succeed." Michael and his wife, Emma, moved into a small house on the edge of the ranch property, close enough to be part of the family but far enough to have their own space. Emma was a sweet girl with a gentle nature, and she and Josephine became close, almost like mother and daughter. Time continued its relentless march forward. In the winter of 1894, Thomas's hair turned almost entirely silver, and Josephine found her first gray hairs. They laughed about growing old together, making jokes about needing spectacles and complaining about creaky joints. But the love between them never dimmed. If anything, it deepened with the years, tempered by shared joys and sorrows into something unbreakable. Sarah left for veterinary school in the East, making the family proud and nervous in equal measure. She wrote home regularly, her letters full of excitement about her studies and descriptions of city life that made Thomas shake his head in bewilderment. Josephine understood her daughter's need to spread her wings, remembering her own journey from Boston to Texas all those years ago. The twins graduated from the local school and began working the ranch full-time, though William made it clear he intended to eventually pursue something other than ranching. James, on the other hand, seemed born to the life, and Thomas could see that the ranch would have a future in his son's capable hands. In the spring of 1895, Emma gave birth to Thomas and Josephine's first grandchild, a baby girl they named Rose. Josephine held the tiny infant and marveled at the passage of time, at how the scared young woman who had arrived in Madisonville could now be a grandmother. Thomas was besotted with Rose, and the sight of his big, work-roughened hands cradling the infant with infinite care made Josephine fall in love with him all over again. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching yet another sunset, their ritual after all these years, Thomas turned to Josephine with a serious expression. "I have been thinking," he said. "That is always dangerous," she teased, but she could see he had something important on his mind. "I want to make sure the ranch is secure for the next generation. Michael is doing well and James will be a fine rancher, but I want to make sure you are taken care of, no matter what happens to me." "Thomas, do not talk like that. Hush, and let me finish. We are not young anymore, Josephine. I am 51 years old, and while I plan to be around for many more years, I want to be practical. I have been working with a lawyer in town to draw up papers that ensure you will own the ranch outright if something happens to me. The children will inherit when you are gone, but I want you to never worry about security." Tears pricked her eyes. After all these years, he was still taking care of her, still making sure she felt safe. "You have given me so much," she whispered. "More than I ever dreamed possible." "You gave me a life worth living," he replied. "Everything good in my world exists because you stepped off that stagecoach all those years ago." They sat in silence for a while, hands linked, watching the colors fade from the sky. "Do you remember the night I showed you my scars?" Josephine asked suddenly. "I remember every detail. You were so afraid, and I was so angry that anyone had hurt you. I wanted to track down the man who did it and make him pay for what he had done to you. I never told you his name. I know, and I respected that. It was your story to tell or not tell as you chose." She took a deep breath. "His name was Aldrich Pemberton. He was a banker in Boston, wealthy and powerful. After I escaped, I was so afraid he would find me, come after me. For the first year I was here, I had nightmares that he would appear and drag me back. But eventually, I realized that he probably never even thought of me again after I left. I was nothing to him, just one of many servants. The scars he left were just an evening's entertainment for him." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice gentle. "He was wrong. You were never nothing. You were and are everything. And those scars he left became part of the map of the most beautiful person I have ever known." She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him. "I think I finally believe that. It took years, but I finally see what you saw. These marks are proof that I survived, that I was strong enough to escape and brave enough to start over. They do not define me, but they are part of my story." "Our story," Thomas corrected. "Everything that happened to you before we met is part of what brought you to me. I hate that you suffered, but I cannot regret anything that led you here." The years continued to unfold, each one bringing new joys and challenges. Sarah returned from veterinary school and opened a practice in Madisonville, becoming the first female veterinarian in the region. People were skeptical at first, but her skill won them over, and soon she was as busy as any doctor in town. She never married, declaring herself perfectly content with her work and her family. And Josephine supported her daughter's choice, understanding better than most that there was more than one way to build a fulfilling life. Michael and Emma had 3 more children, giving Thomas and Josephine 4 grandchildren to spoil. William eventually left the ranch to become a teacher, following in his mother's earlier footsteps, and he taught at the school in Madisonville for many years. James took over more and more of the ranch operations as Thomas grew older, showing the same dedication and skill his father had always displayed. In the summer of 1902, Thomas and Josephine celebrated their 24th wedding anniversary. They were both in their 50s now, gray-haired and lined but still deeply in love. The ranch was thriving under James's management, the grandchildren were healthy and growing, and Sarah's practice was successful. They had built something lasting, something that would continue long after they were gone. On a crisp October evening, Thomas came in from working in the barn to find Josephine sitting in the parlor, looking at an old photograph. It was a picture of them from their 10th anniversary, when a traveling photographer had come through town. In the photo, they stood stiffly in their best clothes, looking at the camera with serious expressions as was the style. But even in that formal pose, anyone could see the way Thomas's hand gently cradled Josephine's elbow, the way she leaned almost imperceptibly toward him. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, sitting down beside her. "About the day I arrived. How terrified I was. How certain I was that you would be horrified by me once you knew the truth." She smiled up at him. I could never have imagined this life. 4 children, 4 grandchildren, a successful ranch, and a love that has sustained me through everything." Thomas took the photograph from her and studied it, remembering that day. "I was thinking earlier about the night you showed me your scars, how you thought they would drive me away, and how all I could think was that I wanted to kill anyone who had hurt you. But more than that, I wanted you to see yourself the way I saw you. You spent years teaching me to see myself that way," Josephine said softly. "Every time you kissed my scars and called them beautiful, you were rewriting my story. You were teaching me that I was worthy of love, worthy of good things. You always were worthy. I just helped you remember it." He set the photograph aside and took her hands in his. "Josephine Zimmerman, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You took a lonely cowboy and gave him a family, a home, a purpose beyond just surviving. You are my partner, my love, my best friend, and I thank God every day that you answered my advertisement." "I love you," she said, the words as true and strong as they had been the first time she had spoken them. "I will love you until my last breath and beyond." They sat together as the evening deepened into night, talking about their children and grandchildren, making plans for the future, reminiscing about the past. Outside, the ranch was quiet, settled in for the night. In the barn, horses dozed in their stalls. In the pastures, cattle grazed peacefully. And throughout it all, the land stretched out under the vast Texas sky, the same land that had witnessed their beginning and would witness their end. But that end was still far off. They had many more years together, years of watching grandchildren grow and great-grandchildren arrive, years of sunsets on the porch and quiet conversations in the dark, years of love deepening and strengthening with each passing day. The scars on Josephine's body faded with time, becoming silver lines that Thomas still traced with gentle fingers, still called beautiful with a voice full of love and conviction. They grew old together on that ranch in Madisonville, Texas, surrounded by family and the fruits of their labor. When they finally left this world, many years later, it was within months of each other, as if neither could bear to be without the other for long. They were buried side by side in the small cemetery on the edge of town, their headstones simple but bearing an inscription that told their story. Together in life, together in death, forever in love. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried on their legacy, working the land and living with the values Thomas and Josephine had instilled in them. The ranch still stands today, passed down through generations of Zimmermans, a testament to what 2 people built together from loneliness and pain and desperate hope. And if you listen carefully on quiet evenings, some say you can still hear the echo of Thomas's voice calling Josephine beautiful, still feel the love that transformed scars into symbols of strength, still sense the presence of 2 souls who found each other against all odds and built something eternal. Their story became a legend in Madisonville, told and retold by those who remembered them and those who only knew them through the stories. The mail-order bride who came from Boston with more than just scars, carrying trauma and fear and the determination to survive. The cowboy who saw past the damage to the woman beneath, who understood that scars were proof of battles fought and won, who loved so completely and purely that he changed everything. In the end, that is what their story was about: transformation. Not the erasing of pain or the pretense that suffering had not happened, but the transforming of that pain into something that made them both stronger and more compassionate. The scars remained, but they lost their power to shame or diminish. In their place grew a love so deep and true that it became the foundation for everything else. A love that healed without erasing, that accepted without demanding change, that saw beauty in the broken places and strength in the surviving. And so the story ends where it began, with a woman stepping off a stagecoach into an uncertain future, and a man waiting to meet her with an open heart. What happened between that moment and the end of their lives was a love story for the ages, a testament to the power of compassion and acceptance, and the transformative nature of true love. They had their share of hardships, faced challenges that might have broken lesser people, but they faced them together, side by side, partners in every sense of the word. The mail-order bride arrived with scars, and the cowboy kissed each one and called them beautiful. In doing so, he gave her back her life, and she gave him a reason to live. Together, they built something that lasted far beyond their own years, a legacy of love and family and the courage to believe that no matter how dark the past, the future could be filled with light. That is how their story ends, not with tragedy or loss, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived, a love well earned, and the knowledge that they had found in each other everything they had been searching for and more than they had ever dared to dream.